This is Democracy Watch. So, Mark, we're going to do a rundown of this disqualification case being argued at the Supreme Court, vying to get Trump disqualified from the ballot in Colorado and therefore the rest of the states in the country. But first, here's Donald Trump's attorney in front of the Supreme Court when asked whether this was an insurrection.
What we said in our opening brief was President Trump did not engage in any act that can plausibly be characterized as insurrection.
All right, and now here's Donald Trump, just an hour after that argument was made, undermining his own attorney.
Because I think it was an insurrection caused by Nancy Pelosi.
So first of all, congratulations to Nikki Haley on her exoneration from causing the insurrection. That's exciting for her. Back to Nancy Pelosi here. But second, Donald Trump admitted here again on the day of these Supreme Court arguments that it was an insurrection. Mark, in a normal world, would that have any bearing on the outcome of this case?
In a normal world, we wouldn't be here, right? In a normal world, if you had a candidate who had been president of the United States, who engaged in the conduct that he engaged in, then got indicted in 4 different cases in 90 some odd felonies, like they wouldn't be your nominee.
Right.
So nothing about this is normal, but it goes to show you that no matter how much the lawyers for Donald Trump, some of them do a reasonably good job. The guy who argued before the Supreme Court, some of them are complete clown shows. We could spend a whole day talking about those. But whatever they say in the courtroom doesn't have any bearing to what Donald Trump is going to say. I mean, just to put a finer point on this, what the lawyer today said in the Supreme Court when he was pressed is not just that Donald Trump didn't have anything to do with the insurrection, but that this is a direct quote, this was a riot. It was not an insurrection. You cannot square that with what he then said afterwards.
Is this something that the attorneys representing the plaintiffs here could invoke while arguing in front of the Supreme Court, that it's happening in real time?
Look, at this point, the case is what the legal term is. It is submitted, which means the record is closed. Like at the end of that oral argument, you heard the Chief Justice say the case is submitted. And that means the case is closed. So if this had happened before, perhaps, but at this point, you just have to hope that, the justices turn on the news or, Truth Social or wherever it is that Donald Trump posts this stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure Clarence Thomas's wife will give him the whole rundown on what happened. Mark, can you give us the takeaways here from oral arguments?
Yeah, so I think there are a few. The first is that I don't think that there are a majority of the court to uphold the disqualification. I mean, you can never predict with certainty, but I think that the conservative justices came out of the box pretty much trying to take the position and or advocating the position and adopting the position that that without Congress passing a special law, that there is no that there's no disqualification. So I think that to get to the punchline up front, I don't believe Donald Trump is going to be disqualified. That is not to say that there were not some really important nuggets that came out of today. One of them is the rest of the quote from the section we've just been discussing. Donald Trump's lawyer stood up in a court of law, the U.S. Supreme Court, and then said the events were shameful, criminal, violent. Okay, so he says they're not an insurrection, but that they were shameful, criminal, and violent. Well, Donald Trump's got a whole lot of legal proceedings in front of him that hinge on the question of whether or not the events of that day were criminal and violent. And it's quite interesting, Donald Trump's lawyer, I'm sure when he said that was thinking, I got to win the case today. We'll worry about tomorrow. But those are very, very significant words because Donald Trump's entire criminal legal defense is this was a love fest. This was a peaceful demonstration. This wasn't violent at all.
Okay, now I don't want to bury the lead on what you just said because I think that's really significant. Is it possible that prosecutors in Donald Trump's upcoming cases can invoke the words of Donald Trump's current attorney arguing before the Supreme Court in those upcoming cases?
Oh, I'd be surprised if we don't see the prosecutors in some of these cases, whether it's the Georgia case or the DC case, now that the DC case is back, seems to be back on the front burner. I'd be surprised if you don't hear the prosecutors raise this point. That a representative of Donald Trump, his lawyer, stood in a courtroom and made a representation that though it was not an insurrection, that the events of that day were criminal. Now he'll say that he wasn't referring to Donald Trump's activity as criminal, but secondly, they were violent, and that is not an insignificant thing. But it's one of a few, like I said, nuggets that came out of here. Another one, which I thought, I cannot believe I'm hearing this, but the lawyer for Donald Trump began the argument by saying that he was worried that a ruling from this court, he said, affirming the decision below, would take away the votes of potentially tens of millions of Americans. I mean, this is what he's worried about, right? Now, set aside the fact that
have someone seek to disenfranchise voters, that's for sure, argues the lawyers for the guy who sought to disenfranchise millions of voters.
Correct. And I can promise you, I can't speak for what prosecutors do because I'm not a prosecutor, but I am a voting rights lawyer. And I assure you that, the next time Donald Trump and the Republicans are trying to disenfranchise voters, which they are doing constantly, by the way, those words will come back. And Justice Kavanaugh, at the end of the argument, seemed to sort of embrace this and said, well, what about democracy? Don't we have to allow voters to elect their candidate of choice? Well, you and I spent a lot of time talking about how the courts have a choice about whether they enfranchise or disenfranchise, whether they allow Black voters or all voters to elect their candidate of choice. So I'm not trying to sugarcoat, what was likely not going to be a victory in the Supreme Court. But words have consequences, and like I said, Donald Trump's lawyers were willing to bear the long-term consequences to win the case today, which I don't fault them for. That's their job. Their job is to win today. But there are things there that I think you're going to hear more about.
Now, one major narrative that was also like exposed during this Supreme Court argument is that if Trump is disqualified, then it would likely start a chain reaction of red states seeking to disqualify Joe Biden, like this retribution tour. But isn't that so backwards, this idea that the Constitution can't be enforced because bad faith actors may abuse the process for themselves?
Yeah, and this was a place where, again, I don't want to be critical of the lawyers because it's easy to be critical when you're just listening to the oral argument. But I thought this was a real missed opportunity, frankly, for the lawyers representing the state of Colorado and more importantly the voters, because that's exactly right. Like, you are essentially setting up a veto of the Constitution, of a constitutional provision, based on the fact that the Republicans will act in bad faith. And that was actually, as you point out, a major theme that started to develop among a number of the justices. Well, what is to stop a conservative Republican from kicking Joe Biden off the ballot for no good reason?
Isn't the answer just the law? The law, like following the law, is to stop them from abusing the system?
Correct. And I think that the problem is that part of the answer that was given is essentially like, well, we have to assume election officials will act in good faith. We have to assume that legislators will act in good faith. In other words, they kind of fell back into a nonpartisan box, which I understand why they felt like the impulse there. But the real answer is what you just said, which is that we cannot give a heckler's veto to the worst MAGA actors here. And the courts would have to stand up against that.
Right. And also kind of it gives them a permission structure to then know that they can abuse the system, knowing that they're going to get that reinforcement at the end of the day, that if they continue to abuse the system, it'll get built in where they ultimately get what they want because everybody else is so afraid of what they're going to do.
Yeah, this argument, like I said, I thought was a real missed opportunity, because there are times that the justices will ask, or courts will ask, well, if we have this ruling, won't this open the floodgates to litigation? And when that happens, there is a certain way you answer the question that takes as a given that litigation is going to be good faith litigation. What I think was missed here is that the idea that, and I'm picking a state, but the idea that like the Missouri Attorney General or Ken Paxton in Texas would do this is not in good faith.
Right.
And so they missed, I think, the opportunity to point out that there would be no basis to do so. And so it's not that we hope that the floodgates don't open or that people would act in good faith to prevent the floodgates from open, but rather the courts would have to shut it down, because that would not be legitimate use of this constitutional provision.
Right. Let's finish off with this. What is the timeline for a decision here?
So look, I think we're going to get a decision quickly in this case. And I do think it's important to also pair this case with the other big news that we've mentioned before, and I know you've done videos on, which is the immunity order, right? So the DC Circuit wrote an opinion that said that that Donald Trump does not have immunity from his criminal cases. That puts the DC Circuit case back in the front burner, which we talked about could potentially turn on this violence issue, which the Donald Trump's lawyer today seemed to make some concessions on. But the Donald Trump's lawyers have until Monday to seek a stay in that case. That is going to set the wheels of the Supreme Court turning on this question of Donald Trump and immunity. I suspect at the same time that they are turning on that, they will be writing an opinion in this case. So I really, they're disconnected. They're not like tied in any particular way, but just the way human nature works. If you're writing an opinion about Donald Trump doing, sketchy things and what it means legally, there's an economy of scale to be writing opinions or to be thinking and researching about both of these issues. So I expect we will get a decision in this case in the month of February. I suspect we will get a ruling denying Donald Trump's effort to stay the other case this month. And so I think by the end of February, you'll have a lot of clarity about where Donald Trump's legal positions stand in the U.S. Supreme Court.
And by the way, for anybody following along with all of this stuff, one of the best outlets, one of the best resources we have to do that is to subscribe to Democracy Docket. That's the free news outlet Marc founded to focus on everything voting and elections. It's a resource I use on a daily basis. So if you're not yet signed up, please sign up. The links are right here on this screen and in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.